London, in the early years of the 20th century. The great metropolis was not only the capital of Britain, but the heart of the empire. The majesty of London was reflected in its Victorian railway stations, in this case at King's Cross. It was a city where the motor car was a novelty, a city of steam power and the horse. But to the north of the River Thames lay another part of London, an area characterised by overcrowding and squalor, and one which was synonymous with poverty: the East End. The East End, in the opening decade of the 20th century, would have been recognised by Charles Dickens. It was a world of narrow streets, wrought iron lampposts and sooty, squalid housing. Fragments of these early years survive on film. They show us the last years of the Victorian age. The East End had grown up around the docks. At this time, London had the biggest commercial shipping port in the world. This sailing ship is arriving at Surrey Dock. It appears that the ship has arrived on a foggy day. London was famous for its smog, when coal, soot and natural fog combined. A very heavy fog was known as a London particular. Sailing vessels were comparatively rare. Most ships in the docks were steam powered, like this one at Limehouse Pier. The area around Limehouse was inhabited by a transient population of sailors, including Lascars. This was the name given to Indian sailors, who worked in the boiler rooms of ships. Foreign faces in the East End were not unusual. These Indian sailors are wearing their best clothes for the camera. This is the match factory of Messrs Bell & Company in Bromley by Bow. The factory yard was stacked with timber. The wood was taken to a machine where it was peeled. The timber used in the stems was planed and then cut using a machine. Note the worker putting his hand onto the machine with such apparent disregard for his own safety. In fact, safety at the match factories had been a continuous issue since the 1880s, when the women at Bryant and May had famously gone on strike. One of the issues had been working conditions. The matches were dipped by hand into a mixture that included phosphorus, and the continued inhalation of the vapour caused a condition known as phossy jaw. The victims suffered problems with their teeth and gums, and if left untreated, the condition was fatal. The factory of Bell & Co dipped their matches by machine. Match factories in the East End were large employers, providing a valuable income for working mothers. The daily output of a match girl was some 2.5 million stems. In 1912, the East End was again on the news. William Booth, the founder of the Salvation Army, had died. He had started the Christian Revival Society in 1865. In 1878, the name was changed to the Salvation Army. He had established it in the East End and focused on helping alcoholics, prostitutes and criminals. Although Booth had worked extensively in the East End, he was not buried there. Instead, his body was taken to Abney Park Cemetery in Stoke Newington. 3 years later, the East End would celebrate another famous figure, Dr. Barnardo. Although he had died in 1905, it was the 49th anniversary of the Barkingside Homes. The occasion was marked by a visit from Princess Alexandra. Booth and Barnardo belonged to the 19th century, but that world was fading. In 1914, Britain went to war against Germany. The outbreak of hostilities was greeted with enthusiasm, and volunteers marched through the City of London. This was the Bankers' Battalion. Although the docks were the main employer in the East End, banks used local men as porters, messengers and clerks. The misery of trench warfare is well documented, but the grim nature of fighting was not apparent from early films, which tended to focus on victories. The Great War was the first conflict to be shown on cinema screens. People in the East End displayed the names of relatives who were fighting on pieces of wood outside their homes. Although trench warfare quickly became a stalemate, enthusiasm for combat remained high. In 1915, the men of East Ham volunteered to fight. Here, the 4th Battalion of the East Ham Volunteers is inspected by Colonel Cochrane. At the time, the government allowed men who were friends to join up in the same regiment. This meant that whole streets lost their menfolk. The First World War was total warfare. As well as the fighting on the front, it affected aspects of domestic British life. In 1916, crowds gathered at the Caledonia Marketplace for a fair dedicated to the war. Being involved meant more than just listening to speeches or buying war bonds. In many ways, the East End benefited from the Great War. The war economy soaked up surplus labour and created jobs. Women found themselves working in jobs previously occupied by men. In 1916, women from the East End paraded through London to highlight their contribution to the war effort. Working in factories and sweatshops was nothing new. The difference was that male roles had been opened up for the first time, hence the pride taken in this procession. One of the new roles open to women was working in armaments factories. Here we can see a factory being inspected by Queen Mary. The East End was well suited to war work. The clothing industry employed over 200,000 people, and there were more than 1,000 furniture makers' workshops in Bethnal Green and Shoreditch. These industries were easily turned over to the war effort, making uniforms and tents. They even made parts for aircraft, since these were largely composed of wood and fabric. The unrestricted use of submarine warfare by the Germans meant that food was in short supply. This inflated prices, causing hardship to the poor. In 1917, Mrs. Lloyd George opened a communal kitchen in the East End. This was in order to feed those who would otherwise struggle to buy food. In 1918, the Prince of Wales visited soldiers' children in Bethnal Green. The Prince was on leave, and his visit to the event, hosted by the Kitcheners Association, was a show of solidarity. A reminder that this conflict was engaging people of every class. Note the soldier on crutches standing by the doorway. The visit of a member of the royal family drew a number of bystanders. In November 1918, the war in Europe came to an end. The docks did not merely receive ships. The area was also home to a number of shipbuilders.
A French liner challenging the supremacy of Britain's Queen Mary. These are her propellers. They weigh 35 tons at casting, and their diameter is 16 feet. It is a tribute to British workmanship that the French liner, which hopes to set up a new record, should come to Britain for her propellers.
The warehouses on the docks were packed with goods, and fire was a constant problem.
At 5 a.m, fire was seen to be coming from a rice warehouse in Shad Thames, Bermondsey, and soon afterwards hundreds of firemen were fighting the flames which roared from the building. Terrific heat drove them back as they directed tons of water into the inferno. Smoke enveloped our cameraman as he crouched on a rooftop a few feet away from this flaming death, the most spectacular fire since Wapping.
In 1936, a major plan was announced to modernise the Docklands.
Soaring trade compels London, greatest port in the world, to launch a vast scheme of improvement to its extensive docks. This model shows the Royal Victoria Dock where work has begun. The old jetties are being demolished. 2/3 of a mile of new deep water berths with modern warehouses will take their place. And from Tilbury to Tower Bridge, the river will meet modern demands. Here the Port of London General Manager, Sir David Owen.
The shipping using the Port of London steadily increases in spite of international difficulties. Last year, the traffic reached the record of 100 million tons gross. The Port of London Authority have accordingly adopted a comprehensive development programme estimated to cost about £12 million.
All through the murky winter days, alterations to the Royal Victoria Dock go on. Diving bells are used by men engaged on deepening the Albert Dock from 29.5 feet to 34. The work is done in small sections at a time, and the continuous flow of shipping will not be interrupted for a single hour until the improvements are complete. Meanwhile, over on the south side of the dock, the new 3-storied warehouses are rapidly going up along 500 yards of the quay side. As across the basin, the alterations go on side by side with the unloading of cargo boats. Hollow cement monoliths are lowered as foundations for the new quay. Mud is dredged out, and when they finally settle, concrete poured in. Hollow piers can be sunk lower than solid ones. From the improved docks, Atlantic liners will run a direct London-New York service, and the world's premier port handle more shipping than ever before.
Many of the cargoes imported at the docks were then traded in the London markets. This is the new Spitalfields Fruit Exchange in the 1930s. London had a number of thriving markets at this time. Cattle brought over from Ireland or Canada were slaughtered and traded in Smithfield or Islington. Fish were sent to Billingsgate, poultry to Leadenhall. In 1930, Ramsay MacDonald received the freedom of West Ham. MacDonald was Prime Minister of the second ever Labour government and was naturally welcome in the East End. which was a political boiling pot. But MacDonald's government was split over the best way to deal with the Depression. In 1931, crowds gathered in East Ham for the general election. Ramsay MacDonald headed a national government to deal with the economic crisis. But as it included a large number of Conservative MPs, his own party accused him of treachery. The politics of the Depression would overshadow the 1930s and would play themselves out in the forthcoming street battles in the East End. Not everything about power was necessarily political. Empire Day was an annual celebration of Britain's colonial power. Cockney schoolchildren would wear blue to school and perhaps visit Hyde Park to see the celebrations. In 1931, Prince George presented the borough charter to the first mayor of Barking. Local government was still dominated by men. Women had only achieved full and equal voting rights in 1929. In 1932, Poplar received some new dust carts. As they were motor driven, they were something of a novelty. It was during the 1930s that 2 million motor cars were on the roads. But a surprising number of trades still used horse and cart, including the rag and bone man. Therefore, the sight of modern dust carts was something of an occasion. The 1920s and 30s is sometimes remembered as the golden era of the East End. This was before the Blitz and post-war development would change the face of London. It is certainly true that there was a strong sense of community among neighbours. Women would do the washing on Monday, a chore that then took the best part of the week as everything was by hand. Washing was done in the copper at home or at a public facility. The women would take the laundry to the washing house in prams. They would leave the prams parked outside. Clothes were washed with a heavy soap. It was one of the few weapons against lice and nits that infested so many houses in the East End. Putting meals on the table was a daily challenge, and families would regularly borrow food from each other. One East Ender recalled how his mother removed his hot dinner one evening and took it to the neighbours. When he complained, she hit him round the head and said, "You're hungry, they're starving." Households were crammed into small spaces and ate and slept in the same room. The lavatory was a bucket. Women would look after each other's children and the doors were left unlocked, although of course there was nothing to steal. Although the East End suffered less than the factory towns of the north, the Depression meant that food was tighter than ever. The last resort was to go to the relief office and get a voucher which could be exchanged for food. As houses were infested with lice, bugs and rats, it was better for children's health that they stayed outdoors. Most children played in the street. This could be cricket with an old piece of wood or tying a rope to a lamppost and using it as a swing. They collected wooden scrap to raise some money. Occasionally their efforts were filmed, in this case on Guy Fawkes.
London kiddies, get ready for the fifth. And the models exhibited for 1932 would turn Epstein green with envy.
Billy, you've taken your father's trousers and got none to put on. And you've actually taken his socks. Come on, Holmes, come on.
A number of nurseries were run by religious organisations. The Anglican and Roman Catholic faiths held a strong presence in the East End. Nurseries would encourage children to paint and draw, much like those that exist today. Note the menu for the children, with its boiled fish and stewed pudding. The emphasis was getting food with the right nutrients into young children. A large proportion of East End families could not afford meat. At the local school, children would learn the 3 R's as well as basic religious instruction and geography. Parents never stepped inside the school gate. It was widely accepted that a teacher's authority went unquestioned. Schools encouraged activities which would seem out of place in a modern playground.
London. At the Jews Free Boys School in Middlesex Street, the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Transport started a new railway. Apart from the engine, this model railway has all been made by the boys, and the boys act as drivers, guards, porters and breakdown gangs.
Most schools could not provide resources of this kind. Their clientele simply did not have the money. A treat for the poorest of the poor would be a day out organised by a charity or church group. In this instance, a trip to Upminster.
Every day from May to September, hundreds of poor children are taken from London out to the green fields at Upminster in Essex. Every day during the summer months this trip is made, and over 50,000 kiddies are given a store of memories to last a year. The scheme was started by Mr. Middlemas, owner of the racehorse Fair Play, and contributions have enabled him to build up the Fair Play fleet. When they get to Upminster, they get out of the buses and dash across the wide open spaces. They've never seen so much of the good earth before, and of course a never-failing attraction is the Punch and Judy show. Gosh, it's hot. That's better. Pull your trousers up. So that's the end of a perfect day. Sleepyheads go jogging back home with a memory that will never fade.
Fairs were a popular form of entertainment, though they normally took place in other parts of London where there was open green space. In 1934, on the first general holiday of the year, crowds went to Hampstead Heath for a carnival. This sort of entertainment was exceptional. On the whole, children entertained themselves. Cockneys were not ashamed of their poverty, nor did they complain about it. Whatever personal despair they may have felt, working families bore it with a certain resilient humour for which the East End was famous. Even the holiday meant working in the hop fields of Kent. A break in the country meant fresh air. Life in the East End was by no means monotonous. Occasionally, the drama of everyday life permeated the streets. In 1931, the People's Palace in Mile End was burnt down. The People's Palace was one of the old Victorian music halls, which had offered a popular mixture of live singing and cheap beer. With overcrowded buildings and coal hearths, the fire brigade was in constant demand. In 1935, 2 firemen died after a wall collapsed at a bag and sack firm in Poplar.
From the Government British News plane overhead, the extent of the damage can be seen vividly. Miles of hosepipe curling snake-like over the ground as 20,000 gallons of water are pumped onto the smoking wreck. The fire was got under control, but not before many thousands of pounds worth of damage was done.
But it was the drama of politics that really came into the fore during the 1930s. In 1934, Parliament met to discuss the budget measures of Neville Chamberlain. The depression and unemployment formed the backdrop to politics. A lighter moment came in 1935 with the King's Silver Jubilee.
Their Majesty's 3rd Jubilee Drive lay through the East End of London. and once again the procession took them through lanes of cheering subjects. At Whitechapel Church, their Majesties changed from car to carriage. Thence they drove to Limehouse Town Hall to meet the local mayors, Stepney, Hackney, Poplar, Shoreditch and Bethnal Green.
When it came to the monarchy, the East End had a very loyal streak.
Perhaps some of the cheers this day were inspired by the thought of the Queen's birthday on the following day, and we take this opportunity of offering Her Majesty our loyal greetings on this great occasion.
The 1920s and 30s had seen some significant progress in slum clearance. Over 250,000 Londoners were rehoused between the wars. The Metropolitan Borough Councils pulled down some 55,000 homes. Poorer families had moved to formerly middle-class areas like Stoke Newington or Brixton. Some East Enders moved out to Essex to fill up the new estates in Dagenham or Beaconstree. Others stayed in the area in new flats like these. While the flats were warm and better ventilated, they did not have gardens. In 1935, the Duchess of York opened a new block of flats on the Isle of Dogs.
I have much pleasure in declaring these flats open, and I wish prosperity to all who dwell in them.
Dickensian courts had largely been demolished, although most people still lived in back-to-backs. Some houses were so bad that the fire brigade were given permission to burn them down to use for practice. The 1930s saw a battle between the forces of fascism and communism. Deep poverty and a suspicion of Jewish sweatshop owners made parts of the East End fertile ground for fascism. The strong trade union movement meant the area was also home to a number of communists. Given that the East End saw street fights on a daily basis, the added fuel of political ideology simply fanned the flames. In 1936, a massive anti-fascist rally was held in London. This had begun peacefully enough, although the police maintained a large presence and made some arrests. The occasion was even marked by a speech from the socialist firebrand, John McGovern.
The working class movement of this country has no time for those who seek to penalise men and women because of their race, their colour, their creed or their political convictions. Therefore we warn you in this country to stamp out fascism in every forum wherever it shows itself.
The rally then made its way towards London's East End. The march included communists, railwaymen and anti-fascist campaigners. The march reached Cable Street in Whitechapel. Note the banners with their slogans, including cartoon caricatures of the fascist leaders in power. It was in 1936 that Cable Street would become a flashpoint for the clashes between communists and fascists. Oswald Mosley was the charismatic leader of the British Union of Fascists. They planned a march through the East End for the 4th of October 1936. The choice of the East End was deliberate because of its large Jewish population. Despite Jewish protests, the police accompanied the march because it was a legal political event. The black shirts assembled in Gardener's Corner in Aldgate, known as the gateway to the East End. There, they found the way blocked by over 200,000 people. A lone tram driver parked his tram at the junction, blocking the way for the black shirts. The slogan among the anti-fascists was simple: "They shall not pass." The police attempted to charge the anti-fascist lines, and the scene quickly descended into chaos. People hurled stones, marbles, chair legs, and anything they could lay their hands on. Mosley was forced to turn around and march back towards the city.
Altogether, 84 rioters are taken into custody, while the police firmly prevent the battle from taking an uglier turn. 80 injured are taken to hospital. Hundreds more receive first aid on the spot. From impartial people, the police earn nothing but praise. So does Sir Philip Game in banning the march. Firm action by the Commissioner and his men undoubtedly averted bloodshed on a scale more terrible than London has ever witnessed.
In the aftermath of the trouble, a number of Jewish shopkeepers had their windows broken. Some bore it with good humour. In the end, they were the real winners. The British Union of Fascists had been forced to march elsewhere. Moreover, as a result of the Battle of Cable Street, the government passed the Public Order Act, forbidding the use of political uniforms in public.
Miss Gracie Fields kicked off at the charity match in aid of the National Playing Fields Association. It's difficult to pick out which are the press and which are the boxers, because the boxers all write for the paper and every journalist has to know something about self-defense in case he gets pushed. But they played some very desperate football. Don't touch it. Mrs. Len Harvey kicked off in the second half and then commenced a grueling fight, smashing shots at goal and spectacular saves. John McCorkindale put in some lightning work for the boxers, but the pièce de résistance was tricky dribbling, featuring Matt Wells. He didn't actually get near to the goal, but he covered a lot of ground, and he would certainly have scored if the ground hadn't come up and hit him.
For the working man, leisure time meant the pub in the evenings and football at the weekend. Supporters would attend the matches in collar and tie.
First Millwall, while the crowd surged and swayed like a wheat field in a wind. Then the white-jerseyed men from the north, Derby County. Derby won the toss, and Millwall kicked off in the face of a stiffish breeze. Thrills came early. A vigorous attack by Derby found the Millwall goal in danger. A shot. But it went safely into the crowd. Again the onlookers got restive and rushed across the pitch. Then once more the play got really exciting and the spectators got all worked up. A few minutes later came the first goal for Derby. A battering attack found Keane in possession and he scored. Shortly afterwards, Millwall equalised through Mangnall, and the score at half-time was 1-1. Derby kicked off in the second half, and this period saw the struggle of two teams battling for that extra goal to get into round 6. It seemed that Millwall had it. From a centre, the ball went to Mangnall, who popped it into the Derby net, but it was offside. Are you still eating? At last, Millwall's persistent attack had its reward. McCartney took the ball and nicked it in, so Millwall won a grand game by 2-1. And for a finish, the crowd ran wild, bursting over the pitch in a crazy, chaotic mass. A cup tie never witnessed any more amazing scenes.
As early as 1936, there were signs that conflicts abroad might develop into war. In October, an anti-gas shelter was trialled in London. The government had started to realise the threat posed by Germany, and the use of chemical weapons in any conflict was widely anticipated.
This diagram shows how private houses as well as works and offices could have their own anti-gas room, built into cellars and equipped with air purifiers. When all the staff have reached the shelter, gas is excluded by the double airlock doors, and there they stay in complete safety, hours if necessary, till all danger is past. Air is sucked in by pumps and passed through filters which trap the poison gas. Ribbons would at once indicate a failure of the supply, and should the current fail, an emergency pump could be pedal-driven, when presumably all in turn would give a hand, or rather foot. Radio might brighten the long hours before it announces the all clear. London's first gas-proof shelter is an example to be extensively copied.
The People's Palace at Mile End, gutted by fire in 1931, was opened by Queen Victoria 50 years ago. Today there is a new People's Palace, and all East London has turned out to wave and cheer King George and Queen Elizabeth, who came smiling to open the new building. First, inspection of territorials and ex-servicemen.
In 1937, George VI was crowned king. The royal couple made one of the first appearances as king and queen on a visit to the East End.
Then their majesties went inside. While they were making an extensive tour within, crowds pressed forward and broke through the police cordons, several fainting in the crush. As their majesties came out again, the loyal men and women and children burst into renewed cheering, such as has not been heard since the Jubilee Drive. It was the first public appearance of the new king and queen together, and it was a happy augury for the reign that lies ahead.
Newsreels in the cinema tended to portray EastEnders as jolly cockneys who met poverty with a cheery smile and some good humour. In the public imagination, the East Ender was a rough diamond. While there was a degree of truth in this image, the idea of the jolly cockney made it easier for people to forget the miserable poverty that EastEnders had to endure. It fell to voluntary organisations and charities to spearhead relief work, with institutions like Tony B. Hall, visited here by the King and Queen in 1938. The King and Queen also visited an East End hospital. The government had made further provision for healthcare in the Depression years, but it was piecemeal and nothing like the post-war National Health Service. As far as cockneys were concerned, healthcare was an unaffordable luxury. The worst aspect of poverty was unemployment. Although London suffered less than other cities, there were plenty of casual labourers who were short of work. In 1939, a crowd of the unemployed attempted to deliver a coffin to 10 Downing Street in protest. Note the slogan on the coffin, which asked for employment instead of appeasement. Unemployment made it difficult to pay rent. Worse still, families were at the mercy of landlords who could raise their rent at a whim. In 1938, tenants in the East End went on strike, and by the following year won a landmark victory over the hated landlords. These strikes were particularly strong in Stepney. Tenants organised themselves into the Stepney Tenants Defence League, complete with picket lines and armbands. Tenements were blocked, barricaded with wood and barbed wire. Sympathetic neighbours brought in food supplies. Note the slogans on the walls asking for food. The slogan, "They shall not pass," was a reference to the successful resistance against the fascist march in Cable Street. The Stepney Tenants Defence League won overwhelming support. They won back some £10,000 in overcharged rents and forced landlords to make reductions. But the people of the East End were about to face an enemy of far greater magnitude than the local landlords. In 1939, Britain went to war against Nazi Germany. Up to now, the old East End of narrow streets and back-to-back houses had survived largely intact, despite the slum clearances. But that world was about to be destroyed as the East End faced its greatest test on the front line of the battle against Hitler. The East End that we have seen was a world of back-to-back houses and narrow streets. Some of those streets had disappeared as new flats were erected in the 1920s and 30s. But on the whole, the area was unchanged. Despite the poverty of the East End, the families who lived there had a strong sense of community. Those ties would now be more important than ever. By 1939, it was clear that a war was on the horizon. In April, a civil defence parade took place in Hyde Park. The event was partly to remind London of the need to be ready, and to act as a recruiting drive.
London's Hyde Park occasionally turns a cold shoulder upon orators and nursemaids and gives its green spaciousness to a serious parade. This time it is a combined civil and military defence parade, and there were cabinet ministers present to watch exercises by anti-aircraft divisions, balloons and ARP workers. A great crowd gathered to watch, and the greater the crowd there is to watch and work, the more it becomes obvious to the world at large that Britain is at last awake.
The government was certain that aerial bombardment would be used, just as it had been in Spain. The authorities were concerned that in the event of bombing raids, mass panic would break out. Households were issued with Anderson shelters. They were light constructions made of corrugated iron. Submerged into the garden, they offered more protection, but they were damp and prone to flooding. It was apparent to most that they would not withstand a close or direct hit, but they were a useful defence against shrapnel or minor blasts. Anderson shelters were fine if you had a garden, but most homes in the East End were back-to-backs with no gardens. Shelters were therefore pulled in the middle of the road, like these in Bethnal Green. To compensate for having no earth, they were surrounded by sandbags. Needless to say, they proved to be a novel attraction to local children. In September 1939, Germany invaded Poland, and the uneasy summer of waiting seemed over. Britain was now at war. But the early months were uneventful. It was not until the following year that London really felt the brunt of the Luftwaffe. On the 24th of August 1940, a single aircraft which had intended to bomb Tilbury accidentally bombed Stepney, Bethnal Green and the city. The RAF retaliated by targeting Berlin. The Germans then switched tactics and began to target British cities. The city and the West End were less of a priority for them than the East End and Docks, which was listed as Target Area A. On the 7th of September 1940, 150 bombers attacked the East End, especially Silvertown and Canning Town. Until May 1941, London would be pounded by the German Air Force night after night. Contemporary newsreels from the cinema portrayed an upbeat note.
High above London, a formation of enemy raiders is a target for anti-aircraft fire, one of the few formations which succeeded in reaching the capital in daytime. It is not an unfamiliar sight at present, but as Royal Air Force superiority grows, as anti-aircraft fire becomes still more deadly, it will take its place as a thing of the past. And London is proving unbeatable. While damage is still being done, the bitter rage of every Briton increases with each casualty, with each brick that falls. Shelters are standing up well. At the same time, it is essential to give the best possible protection to our citizens, to ensure sleep for our workers. To that end, millions of shelter bunks are being provided. The Prime Minister has been making another tour of areas which have suffered from the bombing, this time with Mrs. Churchill. Mr. Churchill never spared our feelings when things were going badly, so we may feel reasonably well pleased to notice how cheerful he looks today. He reflects the attitude of us all. A year ago we were grim and more than a little unhappy. Today we are no less grim, but while our determination is even increasing, we are beginning to feel a bit more cheerful about things. So, once again, thumbs up.
A number of children had drifted back to London during the quiet months of 1940, but were then re-evacuated when France fell to the Nazis.
Another evacuation. Following the great exodus of youngsters last September, this is the second time that the government has considered it urgently necessary for children to be removed to safer districts. This second time we are more accustomed to the spectacle of children being sent away from the danger of bombs. But we must never rest until children are safe everywhere.
London children managed to avoid the worst of the raids, living with families in the southeast. In 1940, evacuated Londoners had a Christmas broadcast from a village somewhere in England.
This little scene is typical of hundreds all over Britain, in villages to which women and children from the big towns have been evacuating. But this was a broadcast and, well, it's a bit of Britain, that's all.
We Londoners didn't expect to be down here for Christmas, but we Londoners are having a jolly good time. Mr. Nasty has took my house away back in Plaistow, but he hasn't broken our spirits and he never will.
What was the best time we ever had, Pan? Oh, last winter when the snow was on the ground. We had a slide outside our house and we slid down it and your best thing cried. Oh, yeah.
Now, what was the Christmas pudding, old boy?
Very tasty, very sweet. I had a summer cake 3 times.
Cool crumbs, so did I.
Ready, go.
For a few days at Christmas, there was a brief lull in bombing, but it was soon resumed. On the 29th and 30th of December, the bombing was so intense that it became known as the Second Great Fire of London. This was when Herbert Morrison took his famous photo of St Paul's enveloped in smoke. The Germans made no secret that the East End was their prime target. In a radio broadcast, the treacherous broadcaster Lord Haw warned that the Luftwaffe would smash Stepney because of its Jewish population. Stepney lost nearly 1/3 of its housing. This film shows us the area around the Mile End Road. The bombing raids created a great strain on the population. Water mains, sewage works and electricity supplies were regularly cut off. The constant bombardment brought a daily threat of death. The emergency services would find ribbons of human flesh in tatters across the trees after raids. Under the cover of the blackout, there was widespread looting and a sharp rise in crime. Nevertheless, ordinary people simply shouldered the daily strain of war. After all, there was little else to be done. The Anglo-Irish novelist Elizabeth Bowen observed that London looked like the moon's capital, shallow, cratered and extinct. Now and then, under streets and buildings, the earth rumbled. The East End knew all about being under the streets. They sheltered in tube stations which were preferable to the Anderson shelters, which ripped apart easily in a blast. There, in the warm draft of the tube, people slept on the platforms while the bombing raids rumbled overhead. Some played cards or talked. Most slept fitfully. Occasionally there were disasters, like the crush at Bethnal Green. But on the whole, the tube offered a sanctuary from the destruction of London. Nevertheless, the East End was defined by strong community ties, and the population was surprisingly resilient. Propaganda films played on this, creating a defining image of the chirpy, cheery Londoner.
Full of beans, thumbs up. Oh, Bob's my uncle, thumbs up. Full of beans, Bob's my uncle, and thumbs up.
But while the image of the brave East End was broadcast across cinema screens, it was necessary to boost the morale of those who suffered nightly bombing raids. Winston Churchill began visiting the East End on a series of expeditions. He had hardly been in the East End since the famous siege of Sydney Street. Instantly recognisable with his trademark hat and cigar, his visits endeared him further to the weary population of the East End. This was partly because he genuinely cared. On one occasion in September 1940, his eyes filled with tears when he saw the dreadful scene of carnage in front of him. "Look, he really cares," shouted a local woman, and the crowd burst into applause. Unexploded bombs were an ever-present threat. The daily task of the bomb disposal squad was to dig out, defuse and then remove the bomb. In 1940, a squad led by Lieutenant Davis removed an unexploded bomb from St Paul's Cathedral and took it to Hackney Marshes. This was an area of grassland on the River Lee. Today, Hackney Marshes is a public park. The bomb disposal squad possessed little in the way of specialist equipment. This can only have made the job more nerve-wracking. But the raids against London continued unabated. At first, the East End felt that the Germans were targeting them alone. In fairness, the city also took its share of destruction, with the loss of 1/3 of its floor space during one night of bombing in December 1940. But the city was banks and offices. The East End was packed with overcrowded housing. Moreover, it received the brunt of the raids because of the docks. German bombers would follow the Thames and target the docks night after night. On one occasion, a gin distillery was hit, casting an eerie blue glow over the Thames. When the Tate and Lyle factory was hit at Silvertown, the Thames itself burned. St Catherine's Dock and the West India were put out of action, and 1/3 of the warehouses in the Port of London were destroyed. Those Londoners who survived the bombing raids faced another challenge. Once their homes were destroyed, there was the question of where to live. Some moved away to the countryside and lodged with relatives. Recognising this problem, the government established a company called the London Hostels Association Limited. Together with a council of management, the LHA was charged with the task of providing hostels for the homeless. The council set to work looking for buildings, which could each hold about 50 people. But with bombs falling every night, buildings had to have basements or other spaces that could be converted to provide bomb shelters. This added to the difficulties of opening hostels. Nevertheless, some 10 weeks after the company was formed, Mrs Churchill opened the first hostel in January 1941.
Mrs. Churchill went to Hoxton Market to open Friendship House, the first hostel of the London Association. The visit was profitable, for Miss Dorothy Dixon handed to Mrs. Churchill a cheque for £500 from American sympathisers for refugees in Britain.
The charges were £1 a week plus a shilling for any meals on Saturday and Sunday. By the end of 1942, there were 33 hostels housing some 700 people, many of whom had been brought to London for war work. After May 1941, bombing began to ease off. But throughout the war it was possible to be interrupted by a dozen or more air raid warnings during the course of the day. The Germans had dropped aerial mines as well as bombs, but it was incendiaries that were the most hated. However, by focusing its efforts on bombing the major cities of Britain, the German Air Force had made a tactical error. The focus on civilian air raids had given some relief to the hard-pressed RAF, giving them a breathing space to regroup. But the East End was not yet through the worst of the war. In 1944, Hitler began launching V weapons against London. These rockets were terrifying. Known as doodlebugs, they emitted a whine which stopped when it fell to earth. The first V1 flying bomb struck Grove Road in Mile End on June the 13th, 1944, killing 6 people and injuring 30. 200 were made homeless.
Yesterday morning at 2:41 a.m. at General Eisenhower's headquarters, General Jodl, the representative of the German High Command, and of Grand Admiral Dönitz, the designated head of the German state, signed the act of unconditional surrender of all German land, sea, and air forces in Europe to the Allied expeditionary forces and simultaneously to the Soviet High Command. Today is Victory in Europe Day. Tomorrow will also be Victory in Europe Day. But let us not forget for a moment the toils and efforts that lie ahead. Japan, with all her treachery and greed, remains unsubdued. The injuries she has inflicted upon Great Britain, the United States and other countries, and her detestable cruelties call for justice and retribution. We must now devote all our strength and resources to the completion of our tasks, both at home and abroad. Advance, Britannia! Long live the cause of freedom! God save the King.
On the 8th of May 1945, the war in Europe came to an end. In London, as across Britain, the event caused a spontaneous eruption of joy and enthusiasm. Streets organised parties with bonfires, food and dancing.
Of all bomb-scarred London, the East End was hit worst. They were never down in the dumps, these big-hearted folk. Now they were in real East End high spirits. The only kind of spirits they can afford nowadays, or the rest of us for that matter. Our enemies are in the dust. Let joy be unconfined.
The East End had endured the worst of the Blitz. Now it was time to build a new world.
It was sensational. 3 weeks ago or more, when you recorded your votes, very few of you would have prophesied a working majority for Labour, much less one of about 200 seats.
In 1945, Labour won a massive landslide victory. Their promise to build a country that was free from the poverty of the past has struck a chord with the nation. Nowhere was this more resonant than the East End, which had suffered such devastation.
Here in the Limehouse division, it was no change, and Mr. Attlee expressed his thanks.
The rest of the country will do as well as the borough of Stepney. The country will have done very well for itself.
Gradually, it began to be clear that the rest of the country was doing as Stepney had done. Newspapers carried the astonishing news to an amazed public. For let's face it, whoever imagined such a result? And slowly the model of it all struck home. Labour landslide.
In August 1945, London celebrated another victory. Japan capitulated to the Allies, and the Second World War was now over.
Japan has today surrendered. The last of our enemies is laid low. Here at home, you have a short rest from the unceasing exertions which you have all borne without flinching or complaint for so many dark years. We also think at this time especially of the prisoners in Japanese hands, of our friends in the dominions of Australia and New Zealand, in India, in Burma, and in those colonial territories upon whom the brunt of the Japanese attack fell.
With the damage from the Blitz, there was a chronic housing shortage. The East End was a sea of bomb sites and rubble. Hence, there was an urgent need to rehouse those who had lost everything. In 1946, Prime Minister Attlee opened a new block of flats in Stepney.
The tape is cut with a pair of silver scissors, and for a number of Stepney families, the dream of a new home becomes a reality.
In the same year, a maternity hospital in the East End received a visit from some fashion models as part of a fundraising drive to raise money. Healthcare had been one of the major promises of the new Labour government, and 2 years later the NHS would be formed, at last making healthcare available to a generation of Londoners who had never been able to afford it. The Luftwaffe had physically destroyed whole swathes of the East End. Ironically, the welfare state would also dilute the sense of community in the East End. While free healthcare and sanitary housing became a right, it meant that people did not need to rely on each other so heavily in the way that they had in the pre-war years. In 1949, Nye Bevan visited some new housing for the elderly in Harold Hill. The state was now taking a hand in everything, from education and healthcare through to old age. However, the changes brought by the welfare state did not happen immediately. Britain was still in the austerity years, when rationing was tighter than it had been during the war. In 1948, Russia sent a consignment of crabs and fish, which were unloaded at the docks. Argentina sent a shipload of meat as a goodwill gesture. Austerity affected everything. In 1948, London enjoyed a distraction in the form of the Olympics. The Games offered a brief moment of respite in the grim post-war years, but they ran on a tight budget. Away from special events, leisure activity remained much the same as it had in the 1930s. One popular destination was a strip of beach by Tower Bridge. This had been opened in the 1930s by King George V to give East End children somewhere to swim and play. The Thames was heavily polluted, but that didn't put people off. Entertainment was on a make-do and mend basis. A new paddleboat converted from a landing craft was launched on Barking Lake.
Barking Lake is the scene of another nautical event as the mayor goes aboard the new pleasure boat Phoenix, a stern wheeler cleverly adapted from an assault craft used in past campaigns. It's a big thrill for the young passengers as the Phoenix begins her peacetime career, making Barking Lake look like the old Mississippi.
The pub remained the focus of most leisure activity. In 1949, the Lord Mayor participated in a beer tasting ceremony.
The first tankard is poured for sampling by the ale conners or official beer tasters. And by the way, it's no use applying for one of their jobs, they've got a closed shop. At a signal from the experts, the Lord Mayor hoists the ale garland of bay, barley and holly to proclaim to all and sundry that the brew is first rate. In record time, the customers were giving their own approval to the steaming mild ale and other delectable drinks, while the Lord Mayor himself gave them a Christmas toast. Yes, the drink of our forefathers is heartwarming stuff. And if it does make the citizen of today feel like a king, the Tiger Tavern has just the right crown to fit him.
The link between the East End and beer was stronger than merely drinking it. The only holiday that was available to East Enders was hop picking. Every year, thousands of East End families descended on the Kent fields to pick the hops. It meant having a break in the countryside, getting some fresh air and earning a little money which could be set aside for Christmas. The hop fields remained an important part of the holiday season for the East End. The work would carry on all week until Saturday, when enough hops had been picked for the dryer. Then the workers were free until Monday morning, although there were plenty of chores to be done. Nevertheless, hop picking remained extremely popular. Although it was hard work, it meant fresh air and a chance to socialise around the campfire. It was hop picking that gave the East End a link with the countryside. Despite being a very urban area, Cockney customs were characterised by a strong rural streak. The Purley Harvest Festival was an annual occasion for the costers and their families to get together. Labour relations at the docks remained abrasive. In 1948, dockers went on strike in support of the Canadian Seamen's Union.
Carrying on with their emergency duties at the London docks, troops tackle one of many important jobs, the loading of armoured cars destined for Hong Kong. Meanwhile, Canadian seamen, whose troubles form a focus point of the crisis, join in an 8-mile march by an army of strikers 2,500 strong. Past the Tower of London moved the marching column, heading for Trafalgar Square, where a mass demonstration was watched by big crowds. A collection by the dockers raised over £300, while the strikers listened attentively to their own leaders and other speakers. At one point, a would-be auditor tried to gate-crash the platform, but as you can hear, was not well received.
Yes, show us your card, brother. And then you'll... Yes, yes.
On a happier note, Princess Elizabeth and the Duke of Edinburgh were at the docks during the same year for a visit to see Pamir. Pamir was the last commercial sailing ship in the world. Everyone else had long since switched to steam or diesel-powered vessels. The following year, she sailed round the Cape of Good Hope. Regrettably, she was sunk off the Azores in 1957 by Hurricane Carrie. The strong show of loyalty to the monarch did not fade during the 1950s. In 1952, following the death of King George VI, the Ministry of Works began preparing stands along the coronation route. The country was emerging from the worst of the austerity years. London put out the bunting in preparation for the event, and in 1953, Elizabeth was crowned Queen. But London was changing rapidly. The familiar sights were vanishing. In the year before the coronation, the city said farewell to the trams.
Paying tribute to the dear old London tram and its 91 years of rattling good service, huge crowds gathered to make the final journey to the depot. When the historic run commenced, there was not even standing room aboard the rocking monster. Those left behind put pennies on the line to get a flattened souvenir of a long walk home. The £9 million scheme to replace London trams by buses had been completed, but the old bone shakers were accorded a fond farewell. And London Transport Chief Lord Latham added a chairman's farewell.
In the name of Londoners and London Transport, I say, goodbye, old tram.
So it's congratulations for the driver who takes the tram on its last run into the depot, where so many motorists have wished it in the past.
Change also came to the East End. During the 1950s, whole streets disappeared as the country became more prosperous. The demolition ball was still hard at work, as condemned housing was reduced to rubble. East End families moved to new towns, like Basildon and Harlow. New towns meant running water and well-ventilated accommodation. Some left for destinations well beyond Essex or Kent. Bernardo's opened a migration scheme for children who wished to start a new life in Australia. The famous Tommy Trinder was there to see them off.
Now tell me, where are you going to? Australia? Oh, you lucky people. Ever been to Australia before? No? I have. Now, when you get to Australia, they'll call you a Pommy. Yeah, they call all Englishmen Pommies. They used to call me Tommy the Pommy.
Industry was also moving out. In 1955, the Duke of Edinburgh visited a factory in Barking which employed disabled people. London was still the largest centre of manufacturing in the country, but the 1950s would be the final decade of its dominance. During the Blitz, a number of firms had relocated across the country and did not return. There were plenty of furniture makers in Shoreditch and Bethnal Green, but big employers like Clarinco, the sweet maker, had left Hackney never to return. In 1956, the Prime Minister gave a send-off for two MPs who were running a relay race to raise money for historic churches in the city, including St Mary Le Bow. A number of churches had been damaged in the Blitz. Church was an important part of East End life. In the same year, pearly kings and queens from 50 boroughs attended the service of St Mary Le Bow. By popular tradition, a genuine Cockney had to be born within the sound of Bow bells, but these had been destroyed by bombs in 1941. However, in 1956, the Lord Mayor of London was present at a ceremony to recast the Bow bells at the Whitechapel Foundry. The church was also a centre of community life for young people. This is the Church of St Peter de Beauvoir in Hackney. Despite an overall decline in numbers, this church attracted new congregations by offering special services, tapping into the new rock and roll music. Church youth clubs formed one of the main pastimes for East End teenagers and were well attended. By the early 60s, the East End was on the cusp of transformation. Vehicles and motor traffic were filling the streets, in this instance near Stepney, and these too would alter the landscape of the city, because they created the need for wider roads. Children still played in the streets, but there was the danger from the increased levels of motor traffic. But it was housing that would alter the face of the East End. At the beginning of the decade, poverty remained a defining characteristic of the area. Despite the massive advances of the welfare state, slum housing and corrupt landlords were still a problem. Most houses now had a flush lavatory, but items which we now take for granted, like TV sets and washing machines, were simply unaffordable. The problem came to the attention of the TV series World in Action, which ran a feature about the state of East End housing. One girl gave her description of life in a slum house.
My mother and father sleep in a bedroom with 4 children. Our names are Maria Bradley, Philomena Bradley, Tony Bradley and Angela Bradley. Thomas and Eddie sleeps outside in a butcher We hear the traffic when the whole four of us are going to bed. And in the morning I am the first awake.
The mother's description was far worse.
5 or 6 weeks in, we couldn't understand the banging of the doors underneath. Then we discovered that it was up to 3 and 4 in the morning. And Mr. Bradley went down the stairs one morning, he stayed in the corner, like in the dark, and he discovered that it was 3 or 4 girls working on the ground floor, prostitutes I should say, and the men was going in back and forward. But we were the room underneath, over it rather. The children was getting awake and going back to sleep and so on. So we mentioned to the landlord, and he said no, that we were wrong. However, the man that was downstairs, he used to come regular about 12 o'clock every day, and the man that was there, he came asked me once, would I scrub out there? I asked Mr. Bradley, would I do it? And he said, no, you'll do no such a thing. He said, you know what's going on. I said, well, the man just asked me a question, so I more or less thought I'd ask you. However, it turned out that the police was round inquiring. They asked me to help them to catch these people, that they couldn't get the man that was running these girls, if you understand. So it would run about 3 or 4 months before they got them convicted, and they got them out. The landlord was taking nearly £15 a week, and was marking on a rent book about £4, and he used to mark the rent book about once every 5 or 6 weeks for them. I heard them arguing over it, and I was there several times, happened to come down the stairs on my way out with the children in the hall, putting them in the pram and that, and I'd have to wait, and the door would be open, and I'd see them paying them out so much, and see him taking them regular every week. He got £15, or if not £20.
The father of the family was a casual labourer from Ireland, and he described the problems that poor families had in getting a better house. A mortgage was out of the question.
I did try to get a mortgage from Barry's Estate Agency in Hendon Centre, but they were asking a very high price, in which I couldn't provide.
How much?
They were asking £300 actually.
The reticence of East Londoners to move into the new tower blocks was simple. Flats had no gardens and did not engender any sense of community. Worse still, in 1968 it became apparent that they were unsafe when the Ronan Point disaster made headlines. On the 16th of May in Canning Town, the corner of a tower block collapsed, killing 5 men and women and seriously injuring 11 people.
What did you see first of all? Well, it's not what I saw, it's what I heard. It's an explosion. And I jumped out of the bed, looked out the window, and just saw the sides of the flat just flaking off, as though it was a pack of cards. And I was too shocked and too frightened, and straight away I ran for our phone and phoned up the police and fire brigade.
In the wake of the disaster, other tower blocks were evacuated so that reinforcement could be carried out. Despite the disaster, most of the residents interviewed were more than willing to return to the high-rises.
They're lovely flats. I gave up a 3-bedroom house to come in here, and I wouldn't part with it. They are nice flats.
You
really
don't
nice.
feel uneasy because of what's happened today?
No. I think they're structural, very sound. I would say that. Well, I should think with that blast, if they hadn't been so strongly constructed, I think it would have done a lot more damage than what it has.
My wife and I, we live at the top of the building, 23rd floor. Of course, we look right down upon the one that collapsed, so therefore we are rather nervous. In the event of these buildings being strengthened, we would like to come back. My wife is very, very nervous indeed.
Especially, you know, when the wind's blowing and all that, you know, you sit there for night time and then the wind's, it's like a 105-mile gale blowing, you know, and you get a bit nervous.
Well, I do feel more at ease, but I mean, like everybody else, you're bound to feel scared. I mean, with me, not so much as the others, because I'm on the 4th floor. But if they move us out and they move me on a lower floor like I am now, I wouldn't feel so bad. But if they can assure me that these flats are safe, I want to come back. Because I've waited 12 years for a place like this. And I've lived in a place that's really wet, and you look forward to a nice home. It's the first decent home that I've had that I can say is my own. But apart from that, as I say, if they can prove to me that they're safe, I would like to come back.
The willingness of tower block residents to return to their flats should not be surprising. Many EastEnders would later lament that there was no sense of community in the flats, but the truth was that they were more comfortable than the old terraces. This suited a lot of East Londoners. Despite the close community of the interwar years, few people wanted to return to the squalor and damp of the back-to-backs. Ronan Point was knocked down in 1986 and replaced, ironically, with terraced housing. The 60s brought another blow to the East End. During the 1950s, factories had started to move out to other parts of the UK. This process continued in the 1960s. Worse still, the docks, the largest employer in the area, went into a spiral of decline. Industrial relations had been a constant sticking point in the 1940s and 50s. Now, with faster road transport and the beginnings of containerisation, companies were no longer prepared to have their goods delayed by strike action. Freight moved to Tilbury and Felixstowe, and to container ports overseas. The once proud docks became a shadow of their former selves, as cranes stood idle. In 1965, the docks had been the largest in the world. By 1968, St Catherine's Dock had closed, the East India had been built over, and the closure of the West India was imminent. In 1968, two Cockney brothers, Joe and Jackie Joseph, opened an entertainment venue called Cockneyland in a warehouse in Petticoat Lane. The opening of such a venue in many ways signalled the final death knell of the old East End. Folk memory and a way of life had become part of a commercialised mythology.
You ought to lend me at least £3. £3! I ain't going to take less than £3. How much? You're a thieving what? I should think so. 15 bob? You're supposed to get 50%, ain't you? 50%. 70s ain't going to knock lightly.
The old East End of cobbled streets and back-to-back housing had largely vanished. It had been characterised by strong community ties and a sense of resilient pride and humour in the face of dire poverty. The annual hop-picking holidays, the harvest festivals and the street parties had all forged a sense of togetherness. But the old East End was gone. The Blitz had wiped out whole swathes of housing. Slum clearance programmes had done the rest. As road traffic increased, the sight of children playing in the streets became a thing of the past. Corner shops, pubs and streets vanished in the wake of concrete walkways and skyscrapers. The old East End, a place of real community, had passed into history.